Former UW La Crosse Chancellor Joe Gao is requesting a hearing in an effort to keep his job at the university. The hearing would go before a faculty committee, which would recommend to the UW Board of Regents whether he can keep his backup job as a tenured communications professor. The board fired Gao from the chancellor post last December after learning he and his wife were producing and starring in pornographic videos. Last month, the interim chancellor filed 3 charges against Gao, accusing him of unethical conduct in using university technology to produce those videos. Gao defended his action, saying he did not use any UW equipment or state dollars to make the videos and insists he and his wife made them on their own time. The faculty committee hearing has yet to be scheduled.